Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into something that's frankly going to flip your intuition upside down. We're looking at a profound, absolutely fascinating, and honestly kind of challenging theological dilemma from our source material. It's a historical moment that totally changes how we think about taking action, leaning on faith, and dealing with institutional authority. We'll be breaking down this incredibly compelling story of St Maria Faustina and pulling out some deep principles about what it actually means to trust.
So let's just jump right into it with an almost impossible question. Imagine this. You have absolute, 100% unshakable certainty that God is telling you to do something. But the earthly authorities placed in charge of you, they tell you to stop. So, who do you listen to? Flipping our natural gut reaction to this exact question is literally the core of what we're looking at today. Because, for most of us, the answer seems super obvious, right? But the history here, well, it's a whole lot more complex.
Which brings us to part 1, the divine dilemma. To really grasp this dilemma, we have to look at St Maria Faustina. She was a nun who received what our source actually calls one of the greatest missions of modern times. According to the text, Jesus entrusted Faustina with this massive, literally world-changing mission. And he made very specific requests. She was to proclaim his divine mercy to the entire world, get an image of him painted, and spark a widespread devotion to his mercy. Our source points out that she had this absolute, unwavering certainty that Christ himself had spoken directly to her. She wanted to obey immediately. The calling was crystal clear, and the stakes, they could not have been higher.
But of course, here is where we hit a massive roadblock. The text outlines a really painful situation. Her superiors just didn't approve right away. Her confessors were super cautious. They questioned her, they delayed the whole process, and they actively restrained her from acting on her visions. Just imagine the absolute agony in her heart. History and eventually the church itself proved she was right all along. And yet the very people God placed in authority over her were telling her to hit the brakes on a divine mission.
It's a brilliant illustration of this agonizing paradox she was stuck in. She's standing at this impossible crossroads. On one hand, it's, Jesus asked me to do this. And on the other, my lawful superiors have told me not to act. For someone with such deep faith, being caught between a personal divine revelation and lawful institutional authority is just a heartbreaking spot to be in. The author actually points out that a lot of folks today would probably just say, well, if Jesus told me, I don't need anyone else's permission.
So, what did she do? That brings us to part 2, the path of obedience.
Faced with this intense spiritual dilemma, she makes an unexpected and, frankly, totally counterintuitive choice. Look at the deliberate actions she takes here. Faustina actively chose obedience. She intentionally laid aside her own judgment and literally surrendered her certainty. She didn't rebel, she didn't go off and form some splinter movement around herself, and she never accused her cautious superiors of lacking faith. She actually chose to listen to her superiors over Jesus, trusting that if Christ really wanted this done, he was more than powerful enough to do it through the church he established. So, she just waited.
And that leads us to a seriously surprising outcome. You'd probably think she failed her divine mission by waiting, right? But the source text reveals that Jesus wasn't disappointed in her at all. Actually, he was pleased. Throughout her writings, it shows that our Lord taught her that this exact kind of obedience is immensely precious. He didn't tell her to go around the church. No. He taught her that obedience to the authority placed over her is actually a mark of authentic holiness.
Let's unpack the why behind that in part 3, the theology of trust.
To really understand the logic of why this intense act of submission is valued so highly, I want to slow down for a second and emphasize this absolutely crucial quote directly from the text. Christ does not need our disobedience to accomplish his will. Let that sink in for a moment. St. Faustina understood something that the text argues a lot of us tend to forget. If a work truly comes from God, well, God knows exactly how to bring it to completion through his church. He is powerful enough to manage the institution he founded. He doesn't need us to break the rules to do him a favor. The source completely redefines obedience here, totally dismantling this modern idea that submitting to authority is somehow an act of cowardice or weakness. Instead, it defines obedience as pure faith. It's the act of looking at a situation and saying, Lord, I trust you more than I trust my own judgment. And honestly, it requires immense spiritual strength to just yield your own deeply held certainty like that. Now let's see how this applies today in part 4, the SSPX parallel. The source material doesn't just leave this lesson in the past, it actually transitions into applying Faustina's historical standard of obedience to a contemporary situation within the Catholic Church. The author uses this theological framework to reflect on Archbishop Lefebvre and the SSPX situation. Now, the author fully acknowledges that the Archbishop had real concerns and traditions he sincerely wanted to preserve, but uses Faustina's story as a lens to examine how those traditions were defended.
According to the text, there is a pretty severe warning here. The author argues that when we become absolutely convinced that our own judgment has to prevail over the judgment of lawful church authority, we are stepping into dangerous spiritual territory. And the text makes a really pointed observation. It is so incredibly easy to convince ourselves that we are simply defending the truth, which suddenly makes us feel totally justified in bypassing established authority.
So, the author's ultimate conclusion on this modern parallel is that it is much harder, but spiritually necessary, to entrust the matter entirely to Christ. The argument here is that true faith requires saying, "Lord, you founded your church. If this tradition is truly your will, you are perfectly able to preserve it through the church you established." It's really all about trusting Christ to guide the institution rather than taking matters into our own hands through disobedience.
Which brings us to our final point, Part 5, the ultimate sacrifice. This complete reevaluation of what makes a true sacrifice really challenges our modern cultural obsession with the lone rebel fighting for a righteous cause. It sets up a really powerful contrast. On one side, you have heroic action undertaken without obedience. The classic rebel taking a stand. And on the other side, humble obedience. The text points out that the saints repeatedly teach us that God actually prefers the latter. He prefers humble obedience over massive, supposedly heroic actions, especially if those actions are rooted in disobedience.
So here is the crucial takeaway. A lot of times, we think the greatest sacrifice we can make is fiercely defending what we believe is right. But the text argues that the greater sacrifice, the one that demands genuine humility and faith, is surrendering our own judgment and trusting Christ to guide his church. That's surrender. It's not cowardice. It is the exact path St. Faustina walked, and the text suggests this immense level of trust is precisely why she was chosen to receive the divine mercy message in the first place. Which leaves us with this final, really striking thought. Based on the framework we've just explored from our source today, if the ultimate test of faith is surrendering your own certainty, what deep convictions are you holding on to that might be standing in the way of true obedience? It's a fascinating question about striking that balance between personal certainty and institutional trust. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer today. I hope this leaves you with plenty to chew on.